My name is Horst Blumenberg, and I served as a German U-boat sailor during the war, a young enlisted man whose world once ended at the steel walls of a submarine. Even now, after so many decades, I can still smell it as clearly as if it were yesterday. The heavy oil of the engines mixed with cold salt water, a smell that never truly leaves a man who lived beneath the sea. I did not die in the war, though by every measure I should have, and that truth has followed me through the long years of peace more faithfully than any rank or uniform I once wore. I am an old man now, my hands slower and my voice quieter, but when the night grows still, my mind returns to the darkness of the Atlantic, to a time when life was measured in depth, gauges, muffled commands, and the constant awareness that one mistake could end everything. I was trained to endure pressure, fear, and silence, taught that the ocean was both our shield and our grave, and on that night, when the alarm first sounded, I understood how thin that shield truly was. There was no heroism in that moment, no speeches or shouted orders, only a sudden tightening in the chest as we realized we had been found, hunted by forces we could not see, listening to distant engines that did not belong to us. The sea, which had hidden us for so long, now felt like a vast empty room with no place left to escape, and every sound seemed louder. The groan of metal, the hiss of valves, the shallow breathing of men who had learned not to ask questions. I didn't think of Germany or victory then. I thought of how small our boat felt, how fragile, as if the ocean itself had decided we had stayed too long. We waited in a frozen stretch of time, knowing that somewhere above us were American ships and aircraft. Strangers who had never seen our faces yet were closing in with calm precision. Fear did not come as panic, but as clarity, a sharp awareness that every choice made long before that night had led us here, deep beneath the waves. The darkness pressed in, and with it came the understanding that survival might depend not on bravery, but on mercy we had neither earned nor expected. I did not know it then, as we listened and waited in the stale air, but that night would be the last time I saw the sea as a free man. When the order finally came, it was not shouted but spoken with a calm that frightened me more than panic ever could, and within moments the boat that had been our world was forced to the surface. No longer a hunter, but something exposed and helpless under the open sky. The hatches were opened, and we went out one by one, climbing from steel into blinding light, then jumping into the Atlantic with no ceremony, no time for last thoughts, only the cold shock of water closing over the body. I remember the sea not as waves, but as weight, heavy and endless, pressing against every muscle as we tried to stay together, counting heads, holding on to whatever floated, knowing that the boat behind us was already finished. For hours we drifted, though time lost its meaning, and the sun moved slowly while our strength faded, the salt burning our eyes and lips, the water stealing heat from our bones. We did not speak much because there was nothing useful to say, and each man was busy listening to his own breathing, wondering whether it would suddenly stop. At some point aircraft appeared above us, dark shapes against the sky, and I remember shielding my eyes, trying to understand whether they had come to kill us or to watch us die. When objects fell from the planes and struck the water nearby, fear ran through me like electricity, until I saw that they were rafts and life vests, floating toward us instead of exploding. Even then, I did not trust what I was seeing, because war teaches you that mercy is often a trick, and I could not imagine that men who had every reason to hate us would choose to save us instead. We clung to the rafts, pulling ourselves up with hands that barely worked anymore, our bodies shaking uncontrollably as the hours stretched on, and still no one told us what would happen next. Eventually ships appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each minute, and as they came closer I saw the stars and stripes painted on their sides, a sight I had known only from newspapers and propaganda. American sailors leaned over the rails, looking down at us, not with rage but with a kind of careful distance, as if we were dangerous not because we were enemies, but because we were broken men pulled from the sea. Strong hands lifted me aboard, and I expected fists, boots, shouting, something to remind me that I had lost, but none of that came. Instead, someone guided me to sit. Another man placed something rough and warm over my shoulders, and only then did I realize I was alive, shaking, and no longer in the water. I'd thought the worst was still ahead of me, that captivity would begin with pain, but as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, Tasting salt and oil on my lips, I understood that the war I knew was already ending, even if I did not yet know what would replace it. After the sea released us, the world became a chain of places without names, beginning with Casablanca, where heat replaced cold and everything smelled of dust, fuel and sweat instead of salt. We were moved quietly, guarded closely, spoken to little, and when questions came, they came in small, careful pieces. Name, rank, assignment. Nothing shouted, nothing theatrical, just men writing things down while watching our faces. I learned quickly that captivity was not a single moment, but a condition of uncertainty, because no one told us where we would go next or how long we would remain there. From North Africa we were taken across the ocean again, this time above the water, packed into ships where days blurred together, and when we reached the United States, I knew it only because the air felt different, and the accents around me were unfamiliar. Interrogations continued, polite, but relentless, always controlled, always bounded by rules I did not yet understand, and though I answered what I was required to answer, I was given nothing in return, not a date, not a location, not even a hint of the larger picture. There were no letters from home, no newspapers, no radio reports, no way to know whether Germany still fought, whether cities stood or burned, whether the war was being won or already lost. Time stretched strangely, marked only by meals and head counts, and without news, the mind begins to drift, inventing its own fears to fill the silence. I remember lying awake at night, staring into darkness, trying to imagine maps in my head, tracing lines from Africa to Europe, from Europe to places I had never seen, wondering how far I had been carried from the life I once knew. The absence of information was heavier than chains because it erased not only certainty but purpose, leaving me unsure whether I was a prisoner waiting for release, a witness waiting for judgment, or simply a piece removed from the board and forgotten. Men around me spoke less and less, conserving words as if they were food, and when we did talk it was in fragments, guesses, rumours that collapsed under their own weight. I felt suspended between worlds, no longer a sailor at sea, not yet a prisoner settled on land, belonging fully to neither side of the war that had shaped me. Even the guards seemed careful not to reveal anything, as if silence itself were part of our confinement, and in that silence I realised how completely a man can disappear without ever being alone. I did not know then where the war stood, or where I stood within it, only that my past had been sealed away, and my future deliberately left blank. Then, without warning or explanation, the routine changed, and one morning we were told to move again, this time under heavier guard, toward a destination no one would name, and as we were pushed forward, I understood that the waiting was not over, only shifting shape. Then one day they put us on a train, and the windows were nailed shut. The train became our world, a narrow, moving box sealed from sight and certainty, and once the doors were shut and the windows nailed over, time itself seemed to lose its shape. Inside there was no day or night, only the dull rhythm of wheels on rails and the sway of bodies adjusting to motion, and without light to mark the hours, sleep came when exhaustion allowed, and ended when the noise changed. We were guarded, counted, moved when told, but never informed, and the absence of landmarks turned the journey into something unreal, as if we were being carried through a country that existed only in rumour. The air inside smelled of wood, iron, and men who had learned to endure without complaint, and as the train rolled on, the temperature shifted in slow, unmistakable ways, cooler at times, warmer at others, telling us we were crossing distances far greater than anything I had known in Europe. I tried to measure the journey by sound, by the length of stops, by the way the engine strained or relaxed, but every method failed, because the scale was unfamiliar and the land beyond the boards remained hidden. Somewhere along the way the sense of being erased returned, not by violence but by movement, by being carried so far that the past felt increasingly unreachable, like a shoreline disappearing behind a ship. Conversations were brief and careful, fragments exchanged in low voices, because no one wanted to give hope a direction it could not keep, and without names of places even imagination grew tired. Yet in that enforced blindness another realization took hold. Whatever this country was, it was vast beyond anything I had prepared for, a place where a train could run for days without revealing a single clue to where it had been or where it was going. I thought of the maps I'd studied as a boy, of distances drawn to scale on paper, and understood how little those lines had taught me about size or separation. The guards changed at intervals, accents shifting subtly, and even that told me we were crossing regions, moving through layers of a nation that did not feel stitched together but spread outward, patient and wide. The motion became a kind of pressure, steady and unavoidable, and with it came the sense that whatever awaited us would be far from the familiar centres of war and politics, placed deliberately out of reach. When the train finally slowed for longer than usual, no one announced our arrival, and the doors remained closed long enough to stretch nerves thin until the engine fell silent and the air itself seemed to pause. Then the doors were opened, and for the first time in days light poured in, sharp and clean, carrying with it a scent I did not recognise at first but would never forget, and as I stepped down, breathing deeply, I smelled pine and understood that I had travelled very far from Germany. Camp Ruston did not announce itself as a prison in the way I had imagined one would, and as I stood there for the first time, surrounded by tall pines and red Louisiana soil, I felt a confusion deeper than fear. The camp sat in the middle of forest, quiet except for distant voices and the occasional metallic sound of gates, and instead of stone walls there were wooden barracks arranged with an order that suggested permanence rather than cruelty. Barbed wire marked the boundary clearly, watchtowers rose at measured intervals, and American guards stood their posts with rifles slung, alert but not eager, doing their duty without spectacle. Everything about the place said control, not vengeance, and I found myself scanning faces and corners, waiting for the moment when the real purpose of the camp would reveal itself. It never did. We were directed where to stand, where to sleep, where to walk, but no one struck us, no one shouted insults, no one demanded confessions or punishment for the past. The barracks were plain, built for function, with rows of bunks and the smell of wood and dust, and while they were undeniably places of confinement, they were also places where men were expected to live, not simply to be broken. I remember noticing small details that did not fit my expectations: the regularity of schedules, the cleanliness of common areas, the absence of random cruelty, and each detail unsettled me more than harsh treatment might have done. I'd been prepared to endure pain, humiliation, and rage, because those things at least made sense within the logic of war, but order without abuse left me without a framework to understand what was happening. Guards spoke when necessary and ignored us when possible, keeping a distance that felt professional rather than personal, and in that distance there was something unsettlingly fair. I began to ask myself questions I had never allowed before, not about defeat, but about intent. Why invest effort in keeping enemies fed, housed, and alive with dignity and tact? Why follow rules when no one would have blamed them for breaking us instead? The camp did not feel friendly, but it did not feel hateful either, and that middle ground was harder to navigate than outright hostility. At night, lying on a bunk beneath a roof that did not leak and listening to the wind move through the trees beyond the wire, I felt the strange weight of being safe and captive at the same time. This was not freedom, but it was also not the nightmare I had rehearsed in my mind, and the contradiction gnawed at me. I realized then that captivity here was designed not to erase us, but to contain us, to hold us in place, while something larger unfolded elsewhere, something we were not permitted to see. And yet, even as I tried to make sense of the fences, the guards, and the quiet routines, there was one aspect of Camp Ruston that disturbed my understanding more than all the rest combined, something so ordinary that it should not have mattered at all, and yet it did. What confused me most was the food. We ate the same food as the guards, and that simple fact unsettled me more than barbed wire ever could. The portions were set by rules I later learned belonged to the Geneva Convention, but at the time all I knew was what appeared on my tray each day: bread that was not ration crumbs, meat served without ceremony, vegetables cooked plainly, and coffee that tasted like coffee. German cooks from among us worked the kitchens, men who had once prepared meals for families or restaurants, now following schedules and standards that did not change according to mood or punishment. The food was not luxurious, but it was steady, sufficient, and predictable, and after months of hunger and exhaustion at sea and in transit, that steadiness felt almost unreal. I compared each meal to memories I could not shake from the war: the long hours below deck, the thin rations measured carefully, the taste of oil and metal that clung to everything, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. On the battlefield, food had been fuel, something swallowed quickly before danger returned, but here it became a marker of order, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had decided we would not be starved into submission. I watched the guards eat nearby, not in a separate hall of privilege, but in sight of us, their plates no fuller than ours, their routines no grander, and that equality, however limited, worked on my thoughts in ways I did not expect. It forced questions into my mind that propaganda had trained me to avoid, questions about intent and belief, and the stories we'd been told about Americans. We had been taught that capture meant humiliation, that enemies would take pleasure in our suffering, and yet each meal arrived without comment, without threat, without the satisfaction of seeing us weakened. I began to notice how my body responded first, regaining strength before my convictions could adjust, and with strength came the dangerous ability to think clearly again. The camp did not try to convince us of anything with speeches or lectures. It simply fed us according to rules day after day, and let the implications settle on their own. I remembered comrades who had gone hungry under fire, remembered how scarcity sharpened fear and anger, and I wondered what kind of confidence allowed a nation at war to feed its prisoners properly. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense, but it was restraint, practiced consistently, and that consistency eroded certainty more effectively than any argument. I found myself replaying old slogans in my head and measuring them against the reality of my plate, and the slogans began to sound hollow. If we were meant to be despised, why were we treated as men who would one day need to stand on their own again? If hatred truly defined the enemy, why was it absent from the most basic act of keeping us alive? Each meal ended the same way, trays collected, routines resumed, nothing dramatic, and yet something essential shifted quietly inside me. I realized that the war I thought I understood had been simplified beyond recognition, and that the truth, like the food before me, was plain, filling, and difficult to argue with. If they did not hate us, then someone had lied. Life behind the wire did not stop at eating and sleeping, and over time the empty hours began to fill in ways I had not expected, turning the camp into something closer to a small enclosed town than a place of pure confinement. A large open field became a soccer ground, and there, under the open sky and watched from a distance by guards, we ran, shouted, argued over fouls, and forgot for short moments that we were prisoners at all. Boots struck the ball, lungs burned, muscles ached in familiar ways, and the simple rhythm of play returned a sense of normalcy that war had stripped away. Music followed, carried by men who had been musicians before uniforms replaced their instruments, and in the evenings the sound of violins, accordions, and voices drifted through the barracks, mixing with the noise of the forest beyond the fence. Some men taught classes, mathematics, languages, engineering, literature, passing knowledge back and forth as if preparing for a future none of us could yet see, insisting through action that our minds were not to be left idle or wasted. American staff sometimes observed, sometimes assisted, and occasionally even participated, standing nearby not as masters, but as supervisors who allowed the routines to continue. Small exchanges followed naturally, a nod here, a brief comment there, a shared look when a joke crossed the language barrier. I began to notice how ordinary the guards were when stripped of distance, how they spoke of home, of farms, of cities I had never seen, and how little their daily concerns differed from ours. They did not treat us as friends, but neither did they treat us as monsters, and that middle ground allowed something human to grow in the space between us. Over time, the word enemy lost its sharp edge, replaced by faces, habits, and voices that felt uncomfortably familiar. I found myself measuring Americans not by flags or orders, but by how they kept time, how they followed rules, how they carried responsibility without boasting. The camp, for all its fences, became a place where the mind could stretch again, where identity was no longer limited to rank or captivity. I was still a prisoner, still bound by wire and schedules, but I was also a student, a player, a listener, a man learning that war had simplified people beyond recognition. These activities did not erase the fact of captivity, but they softened its hardest edges, reminding us that life did not pause simply because we were no longer free. And in that unexpected return of ordinary human interaction, my understanding shifted quietly, away from slogans and toward experience. I did not yet know how deeply that shift would matter, or how violently it would soon be tested, but I sensed that something important was being built inside me, something that could not be undone easily. Then, one evening, as the routines settled into their familiar pattern, we were told to gather, and without explanation they showed us a film. The room was filled before the lights went down, and the presence of armed guards along the walls told us this would not be entertainment, not a distraction like the music or the games, but something intended to be seen and remembered. We sat shoulder to shoulder, the air heavy with expectation, and when the projector began to hum, no one spoke. The images that appeared were not from the front lines we knew, not ships or trenches or men in uniform facing one another with weapons raised. They were places we had never been told about, places hidden behind words and euphemisms now revealed without commentary or mercy. Barbed wire enclosed bodies reduced to bone and skin. Faces stared back at us with hollow eyes, and piles of the dead lay arranged with an order that chilled the blood more than chaos ever could. The guards did not look away, and neither did we, because there was nowhere to turn, and the silence in the room became a weight pressing down on the chest. I felt something inside me resist at first, searching for explanations that would keep the world intact, but each frame stripped those defences away. This was not war as I had known it, not the clash of armed men bound by duty and risk, but the deliberate destruction of people who had no chance to fight back. Around me, men shifted in their seats, some lowering their heads, others staring fixedly at the screen as if movement might cause the images to become permanent. I remember a man beside me whispering a denial that sounded more like a prayer than a statement, and another quietly sobbing, his shoulders shaking while he tried not to be seen. For the first time since my capture, I felt truly exposed, not as a prisoner, but as a witness, forced to look at what had been done in the name of a cause I had served without question. The guards remained still, their weapons visible, not as a threat but as a reminder that this knowledge could not be rejected or escaped. When the film ended, the lights came up slowly, revealing faces drained of colour, eyes that no longer met one another easily, and in that moment I understood a distinction that had never been clear before. There is a difference between fighting a war and committing a crime, between risking death and manufacturing it, between duty and murder, and that difference had been erased by lies we had accepted because they were convenient. No one lectured us. No one demanded statements or confessions. The images were allowed to stand on their own, undeniable and final. As we filed out in silence, the fences looked the same, the guards stood in the same places, and the routines waited to resume, but something essential had shifted beyond repair. The urge to escape, which had once felt like a duty, drained away, replaced by a heavier understanding that running from captivity would not free me from responsibility. I did not want to flee anymore. As the war moved toward its end, the camp changed in quiet ways that were felt more than announced, and life settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around fear or escape, but around time itself. Work details began to take us beyond the wire, out into the surrounding countryside where we cut timber, cleared land, and laboured under open skies that did not belong to any army. American guards accompanied us, rifles present but relaxed, and for the first time since my capture, I moved through a world that was neither battlefield nor prison yard. The work was hard and repetitive, but it carried a strange dignity, because effort once again produced something real. Stacked logs, cleared ground, visible results that didn't vanish in smoke or water. As I worked, I had time to think, and thought became heavier than labour. I considered the choices I'd made long before the submarine ever left port, the ease with which obedience had replaced judgment, and how comfortable it had been to see myself only as a small part of something larger. The film we had seen did not fade with time. It sharpened, forcing me to separate responsibility from excuses, and to understand that following orders did not remove a man from the consequences of what those orders supported. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim of circumstance, and began to see myself as a participant who had benefited from not asking questions. The guards did not lecture us, and the civilians we encountered through work details did not accuse us. Yet that absence of accusation left me with nothing to push against but my own conscience. Freedom, I realised, was not simply the absence of fences or the success of an escape. It was the willingness to stand still and accept the weight of one's own choices. The urge to run, to break away and disappear, no longer felt honourable or necessary because running would only postpone a reckoning that had already begun inside me. Each day of work ended the same way, with a return to the camp and the familiar routines. But I returned changed, carrying questions that could not be locked behind wire. The war ended officially, though we learned of it gradually in fragments and confirmations, and with its end came a new uncertainty. Not about survival, but about what kind of men we would be allowed to become afterward. I understood then that captivity had given me something unexpected, the time and distance required to see myself clearly, without the noise of slogans or fear. When the moment finally came to leave, I did not feel triumph or relief in the way I once imagined freedom would feel. Instead, I felt sober and alert, aware that the hardest work lay ahead, beyond the camp, in a life where no guard would be watching. I left Camp Ruston, but I did not leave America behind in my thoughts. I am speaking to you now as an old man, long removed from uniforms and orders, a man who returned to civilian life carrying memories that did not fade with time. After the war, I rebuilt what could be rebuilt, worked, raised a family, and lived in a Europe that tried to move forward without fully understanding what it had survived. Yet Camp Ruston never left me, because it represented a moment when history could have gone another way and did not. When I look back, I do not remember kindness as a grand gesture or mercy as a speech. I remember routines, rules followed without drama, guards who did their jobs without hatred, and a system that chose restraint when cruelty would have been easier and widely accepted. I was an enemy, captured at sea, brought across oceans and placed behind wire in a foreign land, and at every step there were opportunities to break us, to humiliate us, to teach lessons through pain. But those opportunities were largely ignored. Instead, we were fed according to law, housed according to standards, and treated as men who would one day leave and re-enter the world, and that decision mattered more than anyone may have realized at the time. With age comes clarity, and clarity has taught me that power reveals itself not in what it can destroy, but in what it chooses not to destroy when destruction is within reach. America did not need to prove its strength to me with bombs or threats. It proved it quietly, by insisting on rules even when dealing with those who had worn the wrong uniform. I understand now that this was not softness, but confidence. The confidence of a nation that believed its values could survive contact with its enemies. To the men listening who have lived long enough to see wars come and go, who know that victory is never as clean as speeches promise, I want you to understand what it meant to be on the other side of that choice. Being treated with dignity did not erase guilt or responsibility, but it forced reflection, and reflection is where change begins. Camp Ruston did not make me love America, and it did not ask me to forget where I came from, but it taught me that humanity can be preserved even in captivity, and that lesson stayed with me long after the fences were gone. I did not survive because the war was merciful, and I did not survive because I was strong or deserving. I survived because ordinary men, following a system that valued restraint, chose not to become monsters when they had every reason and every excuse to do so. My name is Horst Blumenberg. I lived through the war not because of violence, but because of those who refused to let violence define who they were,